This fall, Nan is heading to Palm Springs, California. Set against the backdrop of desert skies, we're creating a space for neonatal nurses to take the stage, sharing knowledge, amplifying voices, and driving change. Join us from September 9th through 12th, 2025, to learn from experts, engage in powerful discussions, and take action to drive meaningful change in neonatal care. Head to nan.org/conference to register now and take advantage of best value pricing. Hello and welcome to NANcast. I'm Jill, your host. Have you ever wondered how the guidelines you teach and follow in NRP actually come to be? Who decides what changes from one edition to the next? And how do bedside perspectives, especially from nurses, make it into those final recommendations? Today, we're going behind the scenes to learn how the Neonatal Resuscitation Program is created and updated using evidence-based science, and how voices from across the neonatal team, including nurses, help shape the program you use in your daily practice. I'm joined by two incredible guests, Dr. Gary Weiner, neonatologist and co-chair of the Neonatal Task Force of the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation, editor of the textbook of Neonatal Resuscitation 9th edition, and member of the American Heart Association American Academy of Pediatrics Neonatal Writing Group, and Amanda Williams, neonatal clinical nurse specialist and member of the American Heart Association American Academy of Pediatrics Neonatal Writing Group, who represents the voice of nurses in this process. Together, they're going to help us understand how evidence moves from research to reality and why your voice matters in keeping neonatal resuscitation evidence-based and relevant to the bedside. Let's get right into it. Thank you for joining us today. One thing that makes NRP so unique is its foundation in a global, continuous review of science. I think a lot of NICU nurses are familiar with NRP textbook and the courses and the simulation, but not always the global science machine running in the background. Can you start by explaining how exactly that process happens?
Sure, Jill. So the science process or the science background for the American Heart Association AAP Neonatal Resuscitation Guidelines and the textbook of neonatal resuscitation really start with ILCOR. And ILCOR stands for the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation. And ILCOR is an international organization. It consists of 9 different councils from around the world. It includes 8 members, and then there's a collaborating organization also. And what ILCOR does is it's responsible for reviewing the science related to resuscitation. And this is a continuous evaluation process. And ILCOR consists of, in total, 6 different task forces. And the Neonatal Life Support Task Force is one of those 6 task forces. So we have a neonatal-specific life support task force. That task force has 18 different members and 3 associate members representing 11 different countries. And from that group, we review a collection of resuscitation science questions every year. The task force prioritizes science questions and each year tries to review a certain number of those questions, so that about every 5 years we try to review a large number, something in the range of about 40 questions related to neonatal resuscitation science every 5 years. Those reviews are done in the format of what people would call a systematic review or meta-analysis. So it's a very complicated, rigorous review of the science question. A team that represents multiple countries is assigned to that question, and then the entire task force ultimately reviews in a lot of detail the science. Once that's all done, the Neonatal Life Support Task Force publishes a document that's called a COSTAR. And COSTAR stands for a Consensus on Science and Treatment Recommendations. And those COSTAR documents are published online at the ILCOR website. So that's the product that ILCOR creates for each of these science questions. And you can read them just by going on the ILCOR website, ilcor.org. Those documents are really long, but they go in great detail into the science and what you can summarize from the current science on that topic. And then there's a global treatment recommendation. But those global treatment recommendations, they have to be appropriate for lots of different settings, North America and then even resource limited settings. So oftentimes they're quite broad and they may not exactly fit the context for neonatal resuscitation in North America. The member organizations of ILCOR then take those guidelines that ILCOR produces and they bring them into context for their own region. So in North America, the American Heart Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics work together to take those science recommendations from ILCOR and write a treatment guideline that's appropriate for North America. And then finally, the American Academy of Pediatrics Neonatal Resuscitation Program Steering Committee, the NRP Steering Committee, takes that science recommendation and treatment recommendation from the American Heart Association and creates educational products that help American and Canadian health professionals actually put those guidelines into their daily treatment. And so that's where you see like the NRP textbook and the RQI program and wall charts and pocket cards and skills videos. So everything you need to actually learn how to put those guidelines into practice, that comes from the NRP Steering Committee. And so it is quite a process. It starts with ILCOR with science at the international level, and then it comes to the American Heart Association and AAP to develop the guidelines, and then it comes to the NRP Steering Committee to develop the educational programs that implement those guidelines. So it's a long answer to a really short question.
Yeah, but it's very impressive. I think you demystified the process of NRP and what we see at the bedside, and I think it's really reassuring to know that it has went through such a rigorous process, and it means that the techniques that we're using in those first critical moments in the delivery room or in our NICUs every day are based on such grounded science from around the globe. It's not just one perspective, but perspectives of everybody from this neonatal life support task force. So that's pretty impressive, and it should be very reassuring that it's so well founded in so many different perspectives and research.
And Jill, I think one of the things that's really unique about it and really unique about the NRP as a neonatal resuscitation training program is that, as you said, because it starts at the international level, the science has been evaluated by not just one person who's writing a textbook or two people who sit in a room and come up with a plan. The science has been evaluated by a truly international group. And although if you look at the ultimate guidelines and education program in the United Kingdom or in Japan or in Brazil, it might be slightly different because the resources and the context of hospitals and resuscitation programs in the United Kingdom might be just slightly different, or their interpretation of guidelines that are not, that have some wiggle room may be just slightly different. You know that in the United States, United Kingdom, and Japan, we're operating off the exact same understanding of science. We're operating off of a single treatment recommendation. And so with the American Heart Association and AAP as full participants in ILCOR, you know that our guidelines are consistent with the same treatment guidelines that are being used around the world. And that's pretty unique.
So you talked a lot about the process of ILCOR and how that gathers the evidence. And the next step, obviously, is to put that evidence into something that we can use at the bedside. And then you also mentioned CoStar in the NRP world. Can you break down a little bit more exactly what the CoStar is and why it's so important in that process?
Yeah, so the CoStar ultimately is what really forms the foundation for the treatment recommendations you'll find in the AHA-AAP guidelines, and then what's written in the textbook. So the CoStar is where all of the information is contained. And again, they're very long documents, but it goes over what the exact question is. And the question, it's formed in this kind of funny way that we call a PCOST. And so the question is very specific. We ask, what population are we interested in? What's the intervention you're really looking at? So maybe you're asking for preterm babies under 34 weeks gestation. And then the intervention, maybe what is the exact pressure you should use on your T-piece? And then the C stands for comparison, compared to something else. And then asks what the outcome you're actually interested in. Is it what makes your heart rate greater than 100 quicker, or is it what increases survival? So we ask a very specific question in a scientific way. And then the S and the T stand for the type of studies and the time frame that we're looking for. But that's the way the CoStar is designed. It's around a peak cost question. So it's a very scientifically rigorous design question. And you might imagine when you read the CoStar, it may not exactly answer the question as a reader that you had, because if you just ask the question, does a T-piece resuscitator work? That's a really hard question to answer. And so we break it down into these really, really very specific scientific questions so we can actually try to answer it. And then, so that's how the CoStar starts. It starts with a P cost. And then we have a librarian who helps us to develop a really, really thorough search of the literature. And so we look at the major literature search engines that include everything from very, very unusual, hard to find papers to the most common studies. And we even look to see if there are any studies that are underway. So we'll look at things that are called like trial registries. And so we'll oftentimes end up with, when we do a literature search, something in the range of 8,000 to 10,000 possible studies to review. And then there's a work group that usually involves something like 3 to 8 people who will scan through all of those articles and find the ones they think are actually relevant. And then once they find that, sometimes they're down to about 60 to 90 papers from the couple of thousand they started with. And then they'll review them, and they do this process that's called looking at the risk of bias. And so they'll score how reliable that paper is. And then all of that detail is all in the CoStar. So it'll tell how many studies they found, what the search strategy is they used, how many of them were relevant, how many they found weren't very helpful at all. And then they'll do this risk of bias assessment and tell you, well, this paper was very reliable, this paper was not so reliable. And then they'll go and extract all the data and see if it can be combined together. Because sometimes we'll have studies, especially when you look at the world of like how much oxygen should we use. There are studies that looked at that question maybe more than once. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6 studies, and they came to slightly different answers, but using a statistical method, we'll see if we can combine that data to come up with a more precise answer. And then we'll go through how exactly did we do it, because there's a bunch of statistical ways to combine data. And so the paper, the CoStar, will describe in detail exactly how did we do this. And then there will be tables that show the data combined, and maybe some really interesting graphs and figures that show how the studies all combined together. And then there will be a conclusion that's written in a very, very specific way that tells you whether or not this treatment is helpful or not, or whether we still don't know. And then the last thing is this additional paper or appendix that's called an evidence to decision table. And it explains exactly how the 18 members of the NLS task force took the statistical data and turned it into a recommendation. And they'll explain, well, this is what we valued. This is what we thought was whether or not maybe it's a treatment that helps a little bit, but it's terribly expensive, potentially dangerous, or not very available to people. And so even though statistically the treatment seems to help, the task force may say, we don't recommend it routinely because it doesn't seem to have enough value. And that's all explained in the evidence to decision table. All of these are in the CoStar, which is online. The good news is at the very beginning of the CoStar, there is a short abstract that's about 1 page long and summarizes all of this. But a CoStar itself often gets to be about 50 or 60 pages long. But it is all summarized in that one single page usually. But if you want all of the details to figure out how is it that that the task force came to this decision, you can find everything in that one document online. From there, then American Heart AAP take that huge data and they start to narrow it down a little bit. And so in the AHA AAP guidelines, that usually answers the question in about 4 or 5 paragraphs.
It's such a daunting process, but I'm so glad that you took the time to explain it and to show essentially how the science is turned into the recommendations that we apply every day in our unit. Because I know every time a new edition comes out, nurses are like, "Ugh, what changed now?" But now they know that they can go to their co-star to know exactly why we made those changes and understand, the science behind it. Because I think if you know where the why we're doing it, it makes it more important, and it shows you that the science is guiding all of our decisions and the changes that are made in NRP, not just to be like, oh, now we have to learn something different. There is such a rigorous, daunting, if I could say the least, process to create those guidelines. Once ILCOR has developed these co-stars, how does the AHA-AAP Neonatal Writing Group take that information and turn it into the actual guidelines that we see in NRP?
So the AHA-AAP Neonatal Writing Group, we will review the co-stars and then adapt them into our U.S.-specific guidelines. So looking at each section of the guidelines. So we break up in our group of 12 people into smaller groups to look at each section of the guideline and do our own literature review again, and then breaking down that evidence. We will, again, just as Gary described, reviewing hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of papers to see what is relevant and describe the evidence that exists, similar to, as Gary described, looking at the risk of bias, the level of evidence based on the type of study that it is, this type of study that we have, to translate that into what is our guidelines. And as the only nurse on this committee, I was really intimidated, but also feel very honored to be a part of the group, because I didn't realize how much goes into every single guideline, every single recommendation. We could spend almost an entire hour-long meeting talking about whether something should be considered reasonable or maybe reasonable. And that level of detail, I didn't realize how much thought and time really goes into those guidelines. That was very interesting to me, and I learned a lot working with all of these brilliant researchers and physicians.
And I think that's an important reminder, Amanda, that you said, you were honored to be a part of it, because our bedside nurses, they help shape policy, and I think we forget that sometimes. And I think that's great that there's multiple perspectives on this writing committee, so everybody has a place at the table, that make these guidelines more multidisciplinary, because that's a multidisciplinary team approach in NRP. Let's talk about the composition of the NRP steering committee. Who's sitting at the table, and why is it so important to have such a variety of perspectives?
So, Jill, we've got the NRP steering committee consists of a total of 11 members, and they do represent all of the different areas or the disciplines that are so important to making sure that the NRP educational program is relevant and meets the needs of everybody at the bedside. So the steering committee itself consists of 11 different members, and included in that group is a nurse educator, Krista Blahowiak from Wisconsin. And she represents, again, to the steering committee, she's the nurse educator member. So she really has a focus on the educational needs of everybody at the bedside, and very specifically the nursing perspective. And then in addition to the 11 members of the NRP steering committee, there's a number of liaisons and consultants included within that group. For the nursing perspective, there's Michelle Ryan, and she's the liaison from NAN. Michelle's from California. And then most recently, we've added a really important liaison from the American College of Nurse Midwives, and that's Pandora Hartman. And Pandora comes to us from Baltimore, Maryland. And again, she represents the midwifery view, and make sure that we take into consideration the educational needs of nurse midwives at the bedside. And then finally, we have a number of consultants that help the steering committee get all the work they need to completed. And within that group, there's our editorial team. And on the editorial team, Henry Lee is a neonatologist from California. And our nurse consultant and editor is Chris Cooper. And Chris Cooper is a nurse practitioner from Seattle, Washington. And she participates in literally every component of the NRP educational program and helps to make sure that we are creating a program that can actually be used at the bedside. And so her viewpoint is so important.
It's very encouraging to know that all of these people are at the table. They aren't just observers, but they're actual participants in creating the program and the guidelines that we use every day to ensure that it's relevant for all disciplines. So you were talking about how you go about making these guidelines. How do you take these guidelines and decide what makes it into a new edition of the program?
So basically, each of the smaller pieces of the committee will take the evidence that they find and they reviewed and they present it to the larger group with a recommendation, and we'll have an interdisciplinary discussion about the evidence that exists and how it should be translated into our guidelines, as well as what the level of evidence is that supports it. So how strong of a recommendation is that based on the evidence? And then, as Gary described, that guideline then gets translated into education through NRP.
And then at the NRP steering committee, we'll have an editorial group that starts to try to take all of those guidelines and put them into the textbook and all the educational programs. And you can imagine sometimes the guideline, just because the science itself is still evolving, the science hasn't maybe come to an exact answer on which is the best way to approach something. For some things that you need at the bedside, ILCOR hasn't even reviewed that question yet. There may not be any science yet. And so sometimes where the NRP steering committee comes in, they have to fill in the gaps. So they have to take what sometimes is a difficult guideline because it's not very specific, but we know at the bedside, you have to do something. And as much as possible, we want to make it something that's easy to understand at the bedside. We hope to have it pretty consistent across the country so that it doesn't matter whether you're at the bedside with a team in California or in Massachusetts, especially if you're changing jobs, if you move jobs. We really don't want people at the bedside uncertain what they should be doing. And so we really try to balance the what science really tells us and what we know scientifically to be likely true, what you can do at the bedside, and where there are gaps or holes in the science or the recommendation itself is very broad. We try to give you some guidance that makes sense, is reasonable to implement at the bedside, and hopefully fairly consistent. But to be scientifically honest, there are times when we just don't have we just don't know what the right answer is. And when that happens at the steering committee level, we really have to have a long discussion about should we commit to something so that we can tell people at the bedside, this is what we suggest you do. In that case, we try to be very honest, at least in the textbook, and say, this is evolving. And in the meantime, this is what we think you ought to do. But we may give you a range and say, it is reasonable. Here's a reasonable place to start. But, the science tells us that anything between here and here is probably okay. And that involves a whole lot of things that you've seen evolve over the last couple of editions, even including things like, how do you manage the umbilical cord after birth? How much oxygen should you use? That's clearly been evolving over the last number of years. And even still, the science, there's so much science that has come out over the last several years and so much more still to come. And so that's where the steering committee comes in. They have to take the science and make it something you can really, as a nurse, doctor, respiratory therapist, midwife, do at the bedside. And so sometimes they're filling in the gaps the best we can.
That was always very interesting and impressive to me, of the level of inquiry that the writing group would have, where we would be discussing something and someone would say, but do we really know that? And then, looking at the evidence to see, is it something that maybe was always kind of assumed, and it's like, but do we really have evidence to support it? That I think helped me with my level of inquiry to be like, oh wow. So I would definitely encourage the nurses, the respiratory therapists, everybody to really read through those guidelines to see what is the evidence that supports what the recommendations are and what NRP teaches.
I think that's the most exciting thing about neonatology as a medicine, as a science. It's always changing, it's ever evolving, and that's just amazing to have these new perspectives come in, and the amount of layers of review that goes through for each little change that we do at the bedside is quite impressive. And Amanda, like you said, it's really important for nurses to take the time to read, why do we make that change? And what is the new evidence out there? Because it's going to make you a better practitioner, provider, and also to help educate families. Like, this is why we're doing this, or this is what we anticipate to happen in the delivery room when you deliver your micro-preemie. So that's also very important.
It also could, increase others' level of inquiry, and we could have more nurse scientists that are also studying along with our physician colleagues to create more evidence.
So Amanda, you were talking, I think we need to focus on the fact that as a nurse, you were part of this steering committee. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience there and how your voice mattered in making these decisions?
Yeah, I would love to. So as I mentioned, being a part of the AHA and AAP guidelines for resuscitation, the neonatal writing group, I was really honored to be brought upon it, but I had major imposter syndrome. I wasn't sure that I belonged, but I'm so grateful because everybody on the committee they're so kind, but they're also so brilliant. Working with them, I think it took me back to some of the things that we do in school, the systematic review, the looking at the level of bias. And especially if you're working at the bedside, you may not be doing that often, but you do have that knowledge. And so when I would come to the writing group meetings and discuss alongside everybody, I would learn from their questions, but they also were very open and appreciative to my input and anything that I thought that the guidelines needed. And so nurses are important in the development of guidelines that are at a national level, at an international level. And it's important that nurses take that seat to the table. Even if you feel a little intimidated and scared like I did, they want you there. And it's important that nurses' voices are heard.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Amanda. At the bedside, when you look at NRP providers across the country and NRP instructors, the largest percentage of NRP providers and instructors and healthcare providers at the bedside that are taking care of newborns, by far, it's nursing staff. And so it is so important for us to have the viewpoint and the understanding of our nursing colleagues. We work as a team: respiratory care professionals, physicians, nurse midwives, nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, and so we are truly a multidisciplinary team at the bedside. But the largest group of providers are nursing professionals, and so it is so important to us to have the viewpoint of nurses. And so when you look at the NRP steering committee, we have representation from the nursing professionals, from nurse midwives. We have a nurse educator. When you look at the NRP steering committee, the way it funds research. So at the steering committee, we really value and support the nursing viewpoint on how the program functions, how we implement the science. And one of the ways that the NRP steering committee demonstrates that commitment is through the Jeanette Zeichkin NRP Nursing Grant for Excellence and Innovation in NRP Education. We hope that nursing professionals continue to add to our science and evidence base by proposing to the steering committee educational research plans and get it funded by the Zeichkin grant. So that's really important to us. And then again, Amanda's work on the AHA AAP guidelines committee, that helps to form the science and the recommendations that inform the NRP textbook and its educational programs. So at every level, we want to see nursing participation. And even at ILCOR, at the ILCOR level, right now we have only one nurse participant on the ILCOR task force. And she's from Australia, but many people will recognize her because she is the nurse that was responsible for developing the the oxygen saturation guidelines that we all use. If you think about the target oxygen saturation by minute, those all come from important research done by Jennifer Dawson, who's a nurse in Australia. And so she is world famous, and we use that data, and that data was led by one of our nurse colleagues. And so we certainly hope that we will have additional participation and much more research come from nursing professionals. So at ILCOR, Jennifer Dawson represents the nursing viewpoint. We have representation on the American Heart Association AAP Guidelines Writing Group, and even more representation of nurse professionals at the NRP Steering Committee. And then, of course, I almost left out the critical role played by Christine Cooper, because Christine Cooper, who's a neonatal nurse practitioner, is on the editorial team with myself and Henry Lee. So we have at every single word, every single image, every single graph, and even the way the textbook is laid out and the instructor materials are put together. Christine plays a role in that, and so we have that viewpoint, and it's just so important to it.
Thank you, Gary. I didn't know that it was a nurse whose research actually developed the target oxygen saturation guidelines. That's so inspiring, and I think nurses in general need to be inspired by their voice and their knowledge and how that can shape neonatal care from every single level. So nurses, your seat really matters at every table, and keep that in mind.
I think the big takeaway here is that NRP just isn't a course. It's the product of a living, breathing, global evidence review. And I hope listeners today realize that their voice matters. You have so much power and insight that you can bring to the table, like Amanda with nursing and all the other disciplines that are involved in actually creating these guidelines and asking those critical questions. So thank you so much for joining us today and inspiring us to have our voices heard and also to demystify all of the science behind our program that we use every day in the NICU. So thank you. Make sure you never miss an episode of NANcast by subscribing now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thanks for your support and letting us into your ears. Have a great day.